Welcome to the webinar series, Keys to Unlocking Educational Success, featured by the Margaret Bird Rawson Institute. This program is dedicated to transforming education so that more children can be successful readers and learners. Today, we are so pleased to have Evelyn Reiss with us. Evelyn has multiple advanced degrees in special education, psychology, curriculum design. She's also a fellow of the Orton-Gillingham Practitioners and Educators and the founder of the Claremont School in Ontario, Canada. Evelyn also has created a fantastic program for teachers worldwide called the Great Word House, and we hope that Evelyn will share more about this really incredible program that she designed with us throughout this topic today. We've asked Evelyn to come here and speak on the topic of phonics, so please welcome Evelyn Reiss. Hi there, Evelyn.
Hi there. Thank you for having me.
Oh, we're delighted. We love having you, Evelyn. You're just this warehouse of advanced knowledge, and we really value your willingness to share with our audience, made up of parents and teachers, this essential element called phonics, which is a key piece in teaching reading and spelling. So, Evelyn, just to start, would you share a little bit how you came to do the work that you're doing today?
Well, I spent many years in the public education system, and I always noticed that a certain percentage of my classroom, no matter how hard they tried, were never successful at reading or spelling. And we had a very interactive, motivated classroom. We had newts in one corner, and we had a lot of experimental experiences going on in the other corner. And the children were definitely engaged and motivated, and they wanted to succeed. I actually don't think I've met a child who hasn't wanted to succeed. And all the supports and extra help they got didn't seem to be working. And so I set about looking for answers, which I think typifies my professional life. What are the answers and how to help? And that is when I came across the Orton-Gillingham approach, which was life-changing for me. And I think that was one of the essential pillars of what I do is how to promote the Orton-Gillingham approach in public schools and in private education, not only for elementary school students, but also for high school students and adults. And the more I got involved in that, the more I felt that there wasn't enough being done. And up here in Canada, for the longest possible time, many people said, "What is Orton-Gillingham and what are you doing?" And so it broadened out into creating awareness and establishing various organizations here that would help people understand what are the essential elements of teaching students how to read and spell. And there was a lot of ignorance around that. So there is the educational aspect of how to train teachers that became very important for me. And finally, after I trained many teachers, the question was, well, why isn't there a school that specifically addresses the issues that students with dyslexia face? And so in order to become a demonstration school and to have a school where teachers could train and see best practices in action, I started the Claremont School. And that led to a curriculum which was based on the Orton-Gillingham approach, so that could be delivered in a classroom setting from grade 1 to grade 8. And that led to the Great Word House, which is an online teacher training program. It was created to save teachers time, but to also ensure that their lessons were delivered to the quality and to the expectations of the academy.
I know that what you created must have taken so much time, because so many teachers have to kind of hunt and peck for this material. But even before we get into the issue of, how does a teacher find the structured sequential materials needed to deliver these lessons in a systematic way, I just want to back up and with what you're saying, Evelyn, share a little bit for our listeners to say this Orton-Gillingham approach, which has been around for quite some time, since in the early 1900s, with Samuel Orton, who was a neurologist, and Anna Gillingham, who was a teacher, who teamed up to combine the science of education and the technique, the craft of teaching, to put them together. The principles, though, are used for all children, regardless of whether they're dyslexic or not. So these foundational principles that you're going to be talking about, I just want our listeners to know that this is good teaching across the board for all children. And the National Reading Panel report, which was a Congress Commission study that came out in the year 2000, found that there were these essential ingredients to teaching reading, and the first step being phonological awareness, which Ann Edwards discussed in one of our webinar series, What is Phonemic Awareness? And now we'll be addressing the next step, which is phonics. So can you explain, Evelyn, what's the difference between phonological awareness and phonics? What starts to happen when we start to do the teaching of phonics?
Well, phonological awareness is the ability to process sounds and to manipulate them. And you need to be able to hear the sounds of our language in order to be able to link those to the letters and the little squiggles and the strange writing system that we've developed over hundreds of years. So first of all, your students need to be able to discriminate between the sounds, to be able to remember them, and then to be able to manipulate them. That comes under the broad general term of phonological awareness. Those sounds can be letter sounds, or they can be syllables, or they can be the ends of sentences. So it's the ability to capture in your memory units of sound and then be able to remember them and use them subsequently to map onto letters and to spell them. That's phonological awareness. It has only to do with sound. Phonics is the relationship between the sounds and our alphabetic system. It's the rules and it's the patterns that govern the relationship when you map the sounds onto letters. First of all, we learn our letters, our alphabet system, our 26 letters. But those letters make various combinations, and there are approximately 140 ways that those letters can be combined and make various sounds, 44 sounds. So there are way more letters or combinations, or we call them graphemes, than there are sounds or phonemes. And we have to learn which letters or which graphemes go with which sounds, because there are options, given that there are 44 phonemes, less sounds than there are letter combinations.
So I want to back up, Evelyn, and just highlight what you're saying, because when I was in school, I remember very well when I was a struggling reader myself, and I remember the principal and my mother, we were in the hallway, and I was in the I guess I was in the second grade, but I was being walked down to the first grade classroom to repeat the reading. And the principal whispered to my mother, she has to learn phonics, like if it was an F word, because apparently at that time they had removed the direct explicit teaching of phonics from the schools. And so I grew up in a system where teachers weren't allowed to teach phonetically. They were teaching what they called whole language, I guess. And the idea was that you would memorize these words without breaking them down. And now today they have, in the schools, there's a return to what they say a mixed approach, which, do you have any comment on this whole, like this idea that people could learn in whole words, or this mixed analogy of teaching language?
Well, I think phonics is much more than simply mapping and associating sounds with letters or phonemes and graphemes. It's a lot more than that, because that's where you begin. Later on, you move into larger units such as syllables and then polysyllabic words, more complex words. You also study under phonics, under the phonics umbrella, you study morphology, which is prefixes and suffixes, because they have predictable spellings and pronunciations. So under the phonics umbrella, you're not only mapping letters with sounds, you're also learning syllable rules and you're learning suffixes. And when you add suffixes to words, you then have to learn spelling rules, such as when you add es, when you add s, when you spell with tch or rather ch, and when you drop the silent e, when y turns to an I. There are various spelling rules that you learn that are dependent upon sometimes what you're adding to a word, or what that word consists of. And for that, you need to know how language works. You need a linguistic training. In terms of rote memory, in terms of just learning whole words, there are many children that are able to do that, especially non-dyslexic learners. But a large proportion of students need to be guided. They need explicit instruction about the rules and about the spelling patterns. Once they know those rules, they can work it out for themselves. And with repeated practice and scaffolding and various other good teaching practices, they can internalize the rules and the patterns until it becomes automatic, and they can read fluently and they can spell well. So you have to understand how language works. It's all about teacher training, and it's about understanding how to teach terminology and what is the difference between vowels and consonants. You need to make reading and spelling thinking subjects, and you cannot do that without knowing how the language works. So our emphasis is very much on teaching teachers about how language works, how to explain to children the difference between vowels and consonants, and what's more, how to engage them in that discovery process, so that it's not always the memory, simple memory, that is being relied upon. Even children who don't have dyslexia like the discovery, like the feeling of owning those rules and feeling that they've discovered them, and their engagement with learning language will accelerate the more they feel that they're part of that learning process. So you're right, it's good teaching practices at the bottom of it all.
Right. And, when I hear you say that, Evelyn, and I'm thinking, of parents and teachers that may be listening to this, I want to tease this apart a little bit more, because it makes sense that we have an alphabet, we have an alphabetic code, and there's principles in how you combine those letters together. And then those letters combined can make a sound or a syllable, a unit, right? But when I step back and I think of that time in the hallway with my mother and the principal, what I found over time, even when I was hiring teachers, many of the teachers coming in were not explicitly taught themselves what the letter sound connection was, and what the sounds were, the principles. And I was teaching in higher education, and we had a push in the state that I was in for more advanced teacher training. And when they taught phonics, maybe they taught a class or two on it, but they didn't go very deep. And so one thing I find is that there are teachers, well-intentioned, but they haven't been taught this full range of how many did you say, 144? Or
there are approximately, in my program, there are approximately 140 graphemes, that's either single letters or letter combinations, that make 44 sounds or phonemes.
Okay.
So there are choices to be made.
Right. So a teacher would have to be taught that or have materials that are very explicit, one sound or one unit at a time.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where the work that you created with the Great Workhouse is so unique, because for parents even listening to this and teachers, a lot of that doesn't easily exist. There are workbooks, but many times there's not a concise sequence or pattern that takes you from the beginning, right, from the simple to the complex.
Mm-hmm. There's a common misconception that our language is tricky and difficult and unpredictable and random, but this isn't actually so. A lot of our words form very predictable spelling patterns and are easy to decode once you recognize the pattern. If you're going to teach multiple patterns and confusing letters and sounds together, then it does become very difficult. But if as you say, you go from the simple, the predictable, and you lock in those strong foundations and you build upon them in a step-by-step manner, then it becomes a lot more predictable, and the students experience success, and the success that they experience motivates them to continue their learning. And that is why I think with correct teaching practices and understanding where to begin and what must follow each step that you teach, you can create success with your studies. And that I think is the reinforcing principle. Success leads to greater success. And that's what we've seen time and time again in our school and in our private practices.
I agree. I mean, I had two boys that were they were struggling readers. Oftentimes this is very hereditary. So they had a mother and a father who struggled with reading, and then they too had a hard time. But when they were in school, they would get a very mixed approach. They would have readers that had advanced words in it, and then some simple, like simple closed syllable words, meaning like cat, C and then A and T, and they could break that down, but then they would have a lot of other words surrounding cat, like elephant or, house, or just words that they were way beyond what they knew combined in, and they couldn't read those words comfortably. You know what I mean by the textbooks not matching where the teacher is teaching? What does that, how would you describe for the listener what it means if something is systematic and sequential? How does the material have to follow with that idea?
Well, systematic means that you have a roadmap. You know where to begin and you know where you're going. So you have to know, that has to be clear in your mind. You have to know the logic behind that. Then second of all, it's cumulative. So you're always spiraling back to previous concepts, and you're always giving ample time for repetition. So first of all, you must have a system, you must have a curriculum. And you must understand why that curriculum is the way it is so that you can teach it with conviction. Otherwise, you're just following a book and you're not able to answer the questions your students might have, unless, of course, you've got an answer book, which might be incredibly thick and also difficult to interpret. And second of all, you've got to be able to differentiate. So not every child goes at the same pace. Not every child needs the same degree of intervention at certain stages. So the teacher must be controlling the process, rather like a pilot flying a plane. Sometimes you can be on automatic pilot when things are going really well, but when turbulent weather or if there are unusual conditions, then you've got to be able to know how everything works and your control panel works. And I think it's like that with language as well. So in terms of the systematic approach, for example, I mean, if we start off by teaching using these scaffolds of keywords or a symbol to link, or an image to link the letter name with the sound of that it makes. So apple begins with a, and that's why the image of the apple links the name, the letter name, and the sound that it makes. And we also use multisensory practice, so that memory of the hand, as well as the memory of the eye and memory of the ear, they're all linked. So we try and use motor memory and kinesthetic memory, the way that the letter feels in the mouth and the way it's produced and the way it's articulated, as well as the way it looks. So we're also we're working on 3 neural pathways, and we're looking to make strong neural networks, strong memories. And once we have the memory of how a letter feels in its production, how it's formed with the hand, what it looks like with the eye, and what it sounds like with the ear, and we can string that together, and we can string it together and form short, simple words. We usually start with short vowel sounds, such as a rather than a, or e and e. Those are the short vowel sounds. But a student needs to know what the difference is between a consonant sound and a vowel sound. They're very good at memorizing what the vowels are, but they don't often understand the intrinsic nature of what makes a vowel. And when it is explained to them, it's sort of an aha moment. So there's some sort of logic and reasoning behind all of that. And then you can blend all these sounds together once they've been explicitly taught and memorized. You can blend them together to form simple words. And once you have simple words, you can create phrases, and then you can move from phrases to sentences. This simple little word here is a particular type of syllable. We call this, as you said, a closed syllable. And this image of a closed door is often very helpful for the students. Closed syllable being a syllable with one short vowel that is closed in by one or more consonants. That's where the word closed comes from.
Right.
It's a simple concept, and that's where we begin. Later on, we go on to 5 other syllable types which they learn to recognize and read. But each syllable type is based on knowledge that they've been taught. The components, the elements, the pieces of that syllable have to be learned in order to be able to see it as a whole.
So when I hear you say this, Evelyn, I think the piece I want to highlight for our listeners is in this dimension of teaching the phonics, the principles, the ability to kind of break the reading code and the writing, the spelling code as well, depends on, first, a teacher's ability to have a full toolbox to know what these rules are, what the sounds are connected with the pattern, and to have what you said was a roadmap, that they would have a very explicit understanding that, you know, in this grade, in kindergarten or in first grade and second grade, here's what we're going to cover. But then, and to have materials that would reinforce learning that step, not confused in or tossed in with a lot of other principles that haven't even been taught yet, right? So it's very explicitly taught, and then you go to the next step. But if the teacher doesn't know the roadmap, or the teacher doesn't know the sounds themselves, they're going to have a hard time, right? I mean, they're just not going to know where they're going with this. We saw, I would hire teachers, and sometimes even teachers getting a master's degree in reading. And I remember with this one teacher, I loved her, and I said, well, you're getting a master's in reading, and we have a school filled with kids who can't read. What do you know about teaching them? And she said, I don't know anything. And I said, okay, we'll teach you. She was willing. She knew she hadn't had these pieces taught to her the way she needed. And the materials she was working with were too convoluted, too mixed together, not separated out. And so as a teacher, she was frustrated. And then for a parent, you know, I saw children, they were in third grade, fourth grade, and they still didn't know their consonants and their vowel sounds and to make the correct connection just with the basic, not even combined letters, just each individual letter. What happens what is going on if a child is, in third grade and they don't know what the sound of each alphabet letter makes, just independent of combining these letters?
Well, we go back to a simple example that I gave you before. This has to be taught as k, not as k. A lot of teachers add the on.
Right.
This letter is actually a quiet letter. There's a lot that goes into it. So the explicit teaching of C as k, a letter that is quiet, that doesn't vibrate, it can touch your vocal cords, your throat. It doesn't vibrate, it's a quiet letter. It doesn't vibrate or cause that buzz in your voice box.
Right.
Vowels always do. They're not going to be quiet. They're always noisy, which is why we need them in syllables. Syllables need that noisy letter there to glue sometimes the other consonants together. This one is another quiet consonant. It's not ta. If this was ka, taught as ka, and this was a, and this was taught as ta, this word would be ka-a-ta. It would not be that. So it gets right down to the very basic beginning where you teach each letter explicitly, directly. The student is taught to experience how it's articulated, whether it vibrates the voice box or it doesn't, what part of the mouth is interfering with the production of the sound or of the air, whether it's the teeth or the tongue. And once they know how to pronounce that letter and they can remember that that sound is linked to a particular symbol, and they link it with the memory of the hand, how to form that letter, you're in a position now to be able to ask those students not only to read, but also to spell. And sometimes I've had students and they say, well, what's the connection with the hand and reading? Well, if those neural networks are really strong, sometimes I've had children who have not been able to decode or read a word. But when I've asked them to form the word on a paper or to write it or to trace out, as it were, I don't know if I can do it the right way around, but C-A-T, if they write it in the sky, that triggers a memory and it triggers that whole drill that we do, which is C, cat. And they remember, and the memory of the hand provokes the memory of the eye and the ear. And that comes together and they say, oh, right, it's C, it's cat, and they can decode it. So that's where we begin. But once you've got a simple syllable, you've got those basic sounds of the alphabet, there's a lot that you can do. You can do cat, you can do cats, you can do a cat, you can do the cat. And then in addition to your question about sight words, those are used for the high frequency words that are necessary in our sentences that are either non-phonetic or the patterns haven't been taught yet. So a word like was does have patterns in it that we can teach, but they're advanced patterns. So we teach those words by sight or by rote. But there are a lot of motivating techniques that you can get students, or multisensory techniques you can get the students to remember the sight words.
Right.
Those words are in every sentence, and they're often irregular, and they need to be taught. So as for the whole word approach, that could be used for sight words. trouble with sight words is they're often not associated with very clearly definable semantic information. So it's hard to talk about the word the or a and link it with a particular image or was.
Right.
And so that becomes the difficulty. So you are relying heavily on memory or some other mnemonic that you can use.
Right. Well, you know, as you're saying that, I think what I want to highlight for parents is if you have a student, your child is struggling, one of the first things is to step back and say, for each grade, like if you're in kindergarten, what was the goal to teach? What was the teacher's goal? You could meet with the teacher and see what letters they were teaching, what combination, and then step back and say, did my child learn that? If they didn't and they're passed into the first grade, which then is somewhere else in that sequence and they're going to add more things. But if your child didn't learn the earlier piece, you're now building on a bad foundation, which is why sometimes you see students in about third grade and they're just falling apart because somehow they've managed to make it through, but they don't really have the foundation. And now they're going to start being asked to, in third, fourth grade, depending on the school, they're going to be asked to be using a lot of this. And it kind of is the parting of the ways between those who have it and those who don't. I mean, do you find that at your school? What grade were children starting to come in for that kind of remedial help?
Well, unfortunately, we have very few. We have the odd one in grade 1.
Right.
Usually at the end of grade 1, that the parents and teachers are beginning to become concerned, and sometimes grade 2. So I would say that we have most of our applications in grade 4. And then there's another bump in grade 7 as the students are looking ahead to high school, and there's growing concern or alarm that the next 2 years are not going to be enough in their regular school placement to close the gaps that are now becoming very evident. The issue around the older students is that the less success they have with reading and spelling, the more avoidance there is, the less they enjoy the activity. And as I think it's Dr. Stanovich mentioned, the Matthew effect, he coined that term, the biblical phrase, the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. Those strong readers start developing their skills and become ever stronger. And those who are weak in the beginning avoid it, and they become weaker in comparison to the other group. Those are the parting of ways that you're referring to.
Right.
So when we have students that come in grade 7 who are 2 or 3 years behind their peers, I have to tell the parents that even with the most intensive support, it's likely that they're going to go on into high school needing some additional support as they go through the high school years.
Right. So what you're really describing is the importance in these very early years to get that foundational piece in. And what I found was if you're lucky and you have a really solid, let's say, kindergarten teacher, and they're very thorough and they make sure that each child is identified, whether they can go through making those letter sound connections, that's great. But not everyone has that. And even the parent, like we had a very well-intentioned parent, so I'm very concerned. So when her daughter would go get tutoring at our school and was in the program, so in the evening, the mother would review the sounds with her daughter. The problem was the mother didn't have the sounds correct. So she was kind of undoing every evening everything that we had were trying to layer in. And we couldn't figure out why this little girl wasn't making the advances that she should have. And we had to say to the mom, please make sure, just like we would with our teachers, we could test our teachers that they knew the correct sounds, but we couldn't test all the parents. I mean, we were happy to teach them or practice with them, but I think for our listeners, it's so fundamentally important that both the teacher and the parent has this foundational piece.
Mhm.
Did you find many teachers who maybe didn't have that piece when they were taking your classes, Evelyn?
Oh, for sure. I mean, there's a lot of there are a lot of misconceptions out there, and especially if you haven't had explicit linguistic training, you might have succeeded despite the fact that you've made that your knowledge is partial or in some cases incorrect. But you've been able to overcome that. Teaching a student with difficulties, you need to know the right way so that you can teach the patterns correctly, because they're relying on that very step-by-step approach, almost like teaching a second language.
Right.
It's very rule governed, so
Right.
that and so that the students can follow the rule and be successful until they've internalized it. Yes, I have found that with teachers. In the Great Word House, it originally was just meant to be an online lesson planning tool. But I found that after training many teachers, there was often a lack of recollection because it's a very intense course. So I made a series of videos and video instruction that
Yeah.
they, a couple of minutes at a time, that they could just, yes, oh, so right, that's how you pronounce it. Oh, that's why QU is taught together, and that's why X is a tricky letter, and so forth. So there are a lot of little tips and bits of information you pick up and you remember when you've taught it many times. But new teachers particularly need reinforcement, and they need to have a place they can go to, which is reliable. There's a lot of information around, but not all of it is reliable or delivered by teachers that have been adequately trained. So the issue,
Absolutely. Yeah.
that's the issue. You've got to go somewhere where
Yeah.
You've had that thorough certification and not only training course, but you should have taught it many years. That's really where you come to know
Absolutely.
intimately. You don't learn the art of teaching from textbooks. You learn it by teaching, practicing what you preach.
Well, I teach at the college level now, and what I find is if a student didn't have that solid foundation and being able to a very solid phonetic background for language, by the time they get into college, a lot of the vocabulary and reading the words, they can't decode them. They don't have a deep enough base to be able to do these more advanced words. So they get very frustrated, and their comprehension, their reading level is very weak. For a lot of the students, frankly, they I guess it's it's not well spoken about. But believe me, many of these students are not as highly prepared as they should be entering in college. And if I have students who are going on, they're going into they're in education programs, but they weren't even taught handwriting, so they were not taught foundationally when they were growing up. So, and their college courses aren't going deep enough. So I think that's why, for parents listening, it's really a societal issue. And clearly, if Evelyn is in Canada and I'm here in Virginia in the US, depending on what country you're in, you may have a whole wave of teachers that don't have this foundational piece secure enough. So when parents are wondering what's going on, why isn't my child learning, it could be what I would call a systemic failure to adequately prepare the teachers, well-intentioned teachers, but they just don't get the full toolbox. So if you're a teacher listening and you've paid a lot of money for your undergraduate degree or even your graduate degree, you may need to still go forward and get that training outside of higher ed to go deeper in what you're describing, Evelyn. I mean, where did you get this deeper training? That did you get this in your higher ed program, or did you have to go outside?
Well, I never was taught. I was never taught how language worked. It was only when I studied English as a second language at university, I took that qualification, that we got the grammar and we got the syntax, and we were taught at a higher level on how to teach the English language. But there were a lot of presumptions around that. There was the presumption that you could take any word and you could read it accurately and recall it accurately, spell it accurately. So first of all, there was that presumption. So when I started to teach, I noticed, as I said, this large block of students in every single class that just couldn't learn to read and spell. So I took a specialist course here in Toronto, which consisted of 3 parts. I eventually became a specialist in special education. In none of those parts was I taught how to remediate, how to create a successful intervention that addressed specifically the needs of those students. So I continued to look until I found a teacher, quite serendipitously, who was teaching and succeeding it was a grade 1 student. I was by then a special education teacher, or they called certs here. Anyway, my purview was to look after the special education students, to test them, to monitor their progress, to provide interventions. So I found this grade 1 student in my public school who in fact no longer needed special education services. And it turned out she was an Orton Gillingham practitioner. She'd learned the approach from a well-known Orton Gillingham fellow in the States. And I watched her and I went to see her teach, and I was just blown away. And I decided to leave the Public Board of Education and pursue this methodology because it was so powerful. And so I ended up by training. I was fortunate to find a fellow of the Academy, Dr. LaFrance, who gave the course here in Toronto. And then from then on, I went to the conferences, and I went to the IDA conferences, and I bought books. And I spent a lot of material finding the answers from a lot of wonderful people. When I opened my school, I could not expect my teachers to follow a journey that for me had taken a good 12 years and was very expensive. So that is why I set up the Great Word House, which was supposed to be a cheaper way for them to find the answers and a shortcut. Simply because I also didn't have the time to wait 12 years to really get that training underway. But there are wonderful people out there, and there's a lot of knowledge and a lot of information. And some of them, I believe, are on your series as well, you will be referring to.
Evelyn, I think it's so important for our listeners to highlight. I want to go back and highlight a couple things you said, because it's the same thing for myself and many other teachers that I've known. And this is, to me, it's a little mind-blowing, and it's not meaning to be disrespectful to universities or colleges in their teaching. I teach in them myself, but I think this webinar series is dedicated to trying to look at some of the unspoken truths behind what is going on in these essential elements of phonological awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, comprehension, as deemed important elements by the National Reading Panel report and the work that had been done out of NIH in the early 2000s. And it very much aligned with what this Orton Gillingham approach had known before they had done this research on what are the essential elements. This Samuel Orton and Anna Gillingham figured this out almost 100 years earlier. So this knowledge has been out there, but I think the piece that I really want to underscore for the parents listening is that just because you have a teacher who's been trained in an accredited college or education department, maybe even has a special education degree, through their formal education, they may not have the tools needed to teach reading. This isn't just to dyslexic children. It's across the board. And in the U.S. right now, they're finding that 60% of fourth graders throughout this country are not reading at grade level. 60%. There's an epidemic that actually the Mayo Clinic finds this functional illiteracy rate to be so serious now in this country that it's considered a public health threat because people can't even read their prescription medicine warning information and so forth. So this is a national crisis that has been aggressively tried by many different groups to remediate the problem, but it's a very deep systemic foundational problem in that teachers are not being taught this root information. So just because, like I said, you have someone with an accredited degree or a special ed degree, so forth, it doesn't mean they're walking in prepared in these early years to deliver this form of instruction that Evelyn is talking about. And if you're a teacher and you did this because you want to do the wonderful job, you have a lot of compassion and interest, you just need to know you may need to go get additional training. And only you know, and I like what you said, Evelyn, that it was a serendipitous. I mean, that's many times what I found with the people I've met. They were lucky enough. And I mean, the way I met Margaret Rawson, who is really the matriarch behind this whole effort here in these webinar series, Margaret, she had taken it upon herself in the 1920s when she was volunteering in a private cooperative school that she founded with other parents. She was in the library, and all the kids who couldn't read would come to the library. She took it upon herself to go look for this neurologist, Samuel Orton, in New York, who Helen Keller had gone to find out why these children were struggling. But most people wouldn't take that individual initiative to try to figure out what was going on. And that opened up the whole world of this Orton Gillingham foundational instruction that, many sometimes elite, well-to-do families have had access to. But now what you're doing and talking about, Evelyn, is getting it out to the masses, right? I mean, are school districts open to this information, or a particular country?
I find that Canada is a very, very spread out country. It's there are pockets of knowledge. So on the West Coast, I think there is a greater success and a greater openness to this particular approach, this methodology. In Toronto, in the private schools, there has become a willingness to be retrained or to embrace this particular approach. The private schools often have a different mandate, and special education is secondary. They often limit their admissions for students that require special education support, but they are at least open to looking at a number of different approaches and theories. The public boards here are very closed, and they have even said to me many times, we don't use the term dyslexia anymore. They don't recognize it as a particular cluster of symptoms, difficulty in reading and spelling. They look upon it as a language learning disability. There's still a great deal of mystery around what a language disability is. And they don't see dyslexia as a specific type of language disability. They very much go with board-driven initiatives, and there is often the flavor of the month. So right now it's play-based in kindergarten, which is very unhelpful for students with phonological awareness difficulties, issues around hearing information in a very noisy room. They need structure and they need direct instruction, explicit instruction, and they're getting to play. Not that play is not important. It is, but there's always the question here of the baby and the bathwater. It always seems to be that the good things cannot be retained, and the new research and new initiatives can't be in some way combined with what they already know works or what research says works. So here in Canada, apart from the West Coast, where there's a tradition of organizations that call Orton Gillingham what it is and have branched out, there's very little work being done here to embrace this kind of multisensory, what I call practical linguistics training. The Ministry of Education has recently increased in Ontario the training to 2 years, from 1 to 2 years, and you would think they would have time to teach more linguistics, but that has not been seen as important enough, and it's not as yet a component. So we're not sure what will bring about change here. I think it has to be a grassroots movement. It has to come from the parents where the votes are, and that's
Right.
why the more awareness that everybody gets about the fact that there is a way to help the children and that this does work. And that's part of what my school does. It's to show people that it can work and it does work. We are being successful. I started the school 8 years ago with 6 students. I now have 73. I don't advertise, and I have a waiting list. And that is a testament not only to to our approach and that it works, but that the system, the public system, is failing these students.
Yeah.
It's a great shame, and because we do have answers.
Absolutely. You know, Evelyn, when you say that, it's so true, because there are children who, I remember Margaret saying you can line everybody up shoulder to shoulder, and you have a range. Those people who really, they start reading at such a young age, no one even knows how, but they've gone through these steps, but they do it so quickly, almost invisibly. And then you have those at the other end who are really struggling. And right now, it's sometimes there are children who can't read because they neurologically needed this training to be slowed down, very explicit, and like you're saying, the multi-sensory piece, so that while they're learning these phonetic principles, they're seeing it, they're saying it, they're hearing it, and they're writing it all together to make a type of brain glue to make it stick. And if they neurologically need that, they need it, and they need it slower and systematically. And then there's children who don't have that neurological, let's call it a weakness or a style of brain architecture. They don't have that, but they're not learning it either because it isn't being taught. It's just not being taught. So they look maybe like they're not getting it, but they're not getting it because they never had anything to learn, right? So if you have this, like what you're describing is such good teaching that anybody would benefit, from the regular student to someone who neurologically needs it more deeper foundationally.
Yeah.
The problem that I see is, even if tomorrow the laws were rewritten for everyone to teach this way, you don't have the teachers in higher ed to teach the teachers. You don't have the base, a widespread base of let's call them master teachers, the teachers who teach the teachers. They're just simply not out there. And so everyone kind of goes along acting like the children are being taught, and then labeling the child whether they get it or don't get it, like if it's their fault, when systemically the teaching, like what you're describing, just isn't there. There's not that many teachers. I could not find enough teachers who had this knowledge to even hire in my school. We had to make those teachers. We had to retrain them. Do you find teachers coming in ready for this?
No, the teachers that we have don't know this approach at all. They don't know enough about language. So
Right.
that's the course that I give. Every teacher that teaches language, even if they're music teachers and they don't teach the language, they have to take the course. Whether they're music teachers or science teachers, they need to take the course and train. And then we have a mentorship program in our school. So we have more experienced teachers mentoring less experienced teachers. we were very involved in the classroom. I think it's very labor intensive, but it's not labor intensive forever because it's one generation teaching the next. And I think we need the same kind of support and access to expertise as their students do. And that's the model that we follow. But our school has approximately, as I told you, 73 students. It becomes more complex and more of a managerial and financial consideration when you have schools of hundreds of students. But what needs to happen is that the teachers need support, either from directors or literacy specialists, that don't just drop in with a couple of worksheets and some interesting tricks and tips that can help short term. They need to be there to train the teachers and understand how language works from the bottom up.
Absolutely. Well, Evelyn, if you don't mind, as we're coming to the end of this interview, I want to just step back and do some takeaways. I want to make sure that we've covered everything that you would want. Are there any other particular tidbits that you wanted to share on phonics, or else otherwise I just want to back up and recap a minute. Is that all right with you? Okay, so let's just revisit. Give again, one more time, the definition of phonics. What is phonics?
So phonics is the teaching of the sounds of the English language and how they map on to the letters of the English language. So it's the sounds, which we call phonemes, mapping on to the letters, which we call graphemes. And it's teaching the rules and the patterns of how that happens to make language predictable in its spelling and reading.
Okay. And that's beautiful. That's so important. And it's taking it down into the root of that alphabetic principle with whatever language you're in. Then the next.
Sorry, and I don't only want to leave it as letters and sounds. It does include morphology, and it includes spelling rules. So it's much larger than just the alphabet and the sounds of the alphabet, because those letters combine to make sounds which can be represented by other letter combinations. So it's helping students to make the choices of the correct symbols associated with the sounds. There are more graphemes than there are phonemes.
Okay, and you used a term morphology, morphemes. What can you define that for the listener?
Okay, so morphology are the smallest parts of the word that contain meaning. So for example, S has the meaning of plural, or it's also used as a third person singular verb. So it is used in a third person singular verb. So that is a suffix. Suffixes have meanings. Part of a word such as cat, that's a morpheme. It has meaning. It represents certain animal. The prefix "un" means no or not. That has meaning. So it's the smallest part of a word that has meaning. That's a morpheme. And that's another unit which we teach, which is predictable and which helps students to read and spell.
Okay, so you have this definition that you've given of phonics being more than just at the simplest level, the connection of the sound to the letter, but then those sounds, those letters combine together for larger units all the way up into words themselves, or units of meaning, which you said morphemes. Is that better? Am I getting that right?
That's fine. That's great.
Okay. So for teachers, you want to step back and say, have I been taught these rules or principles? If not, go out there and get your more tools for your toolbox. And if you're a parent, you need to ask with each grade and teacher that your child has, what is the roadmap for teaching this? What units of letters to sound on up to words? What are they going to cover that year? And do they have the materials and the training, you need to step back and look at that whole process. And if you want to help your child, you want to make sure you're connecting the right sounds with the letters and units of combined words, letters together to make words, that you're doing that properly yourself. Would that be a good step back takeaway, or how would you say that, Evelyn, to teachers and parents? That's even, let me ask you that, you'll say it better.
Very, very simply, I would say it's reading and spelling the alphabet, knowing syllables, the 6 syllable types, being able to combine those syllable types to form polysyllabic words, to be able to add to those words prefixes and suffixes so that you can read even more complex terms and use them in sentences that have realistic language. Because reading The Red Tug Sat in the Mud, or one of those kind of books, that is, the students are way smarter than that kind of language. And they need to be reading realistic language that they can relate to, that can convey complex meaning. And they also need, along with that, they need sight words, which are very important. So there is the predictable. A large part of our language is predictable and can be taught with these patterns and spelling rules. Then there are the sight words, which need to be learned by rote or by mnemonics or other memory aids. And all together, put all that together, then the students are able to go to the next step, which is reading chunks of text.
Right.
Yeah, for the purpose of conveying and understanding somebody else's meaning, or writing that they can communicate their own meaning.
Okay, and one last takeaway, Evelyn, I want to highlight that you said, because I think this is so important and often even misunderstood, is the best way to teach these principles, to teach phonics. You were saying to use a multisensory way. And can you define that one more time? So in teaching this, you're not just having the student hear the sounds, independent of seeing the sounds or writing the sounds. You're doing it all together. Or will you describe that one more time?
Well, a multisensory language with our specific purposes in mind, mean combining motor memory, which is the memory of the hand, if you can think of it as that, which is the way letters are shaped and formed. It's the direction of the strokes that get to form each letter: backwards, forwards, circular, up and down. And also it is the memory of the ear, that means the sound that the letter makes and the letter name. And it is also the memory of the eye, which is the way that the letter shape looks. And linking all of those together, the letter, the funny little squiggle on the page, the sound that it makes, and what the hand has to do in order to form that letter independently.
Right. So if you leave out one piece, if you're just seeing the letter and saying it, but you're not writing it, what I'm hearing you say is it doesn't stick well enough. It doesn't secure into the memory deep enough.
You're often hitting the weaknesses of the student, that is either their visual or their auditory memory. And you also have the kinesthetic aspect or dimension, which is how that letter feels when it's produced. And some students have weaknesses both auditorily, they cannot hear accurately, and they cannot discriminate. They cannot see the little differences in all those squiggles. So then they can rely on how the letter feels, how the tongue and the teeth and the voice box or the vocal cords and the lips, the whole oral tract, all of that, how the letter is produced.
Right.
Sometimes that helps them link the memories. So if you know that it's pronounced so with your tongue tapping at your teeth and a little space between your teeth, it's very different to the D, because you have a vibration of the voice box. So if you know that are really produced in exactly the same way, but just the voice box vibrates in one country, it helps you to understand and maybe appreciate the difficulties that the student is having when you know that they're produced in the same way, but they differ in one very crucial aspect, and that's the vibration. So you need to know how these sounds are produced. Helpful to know uh, that consonants always involve some sort of interference or blockage or obstruction of the air coming out of the mouth or nose, but that the vowels are totally unobstructed, noisy streams of air.
Right.
All these little bits of pieces of information are built upon as the child steps from simple to complicated words.
Well, Evelyn, thank you so much for going over this. And I hope that our listeners can begin to hear what this discussion sounds like. So what is phonics? How is it best taught? What are the systemic barriers that have prevented just children from getting taught this way? And is there anything else that you would like to add on this before we close, or do you feel like we've covered the main points that you wanted to secure for our listeners?
I would say, in addition to explicit or direct instruction, multisensory teaching, and repetition, I would say it's important to give the child enough time to consolidate the information. Not every child can be taught, remember, and then move on. It's often the speed with which students are introduced to new material that also confounds them. Each child has to take the time that child needs, and the teacher needs to be patient and understanding. They might have a goal or an objective or an educational instruction that they want to get to, but the child needs the time, and the child's brain, the student's brain, needs time to make strong neural pathways. And so I would advise patience and repetition, many opportunities for repetition. And scaffolding is also important. Scaffolding being the support that it takes to make a student successful in a lesson. So don't expect every student to be successful with the concept delivered and the exercises given. Sometimes the teacher has to go the extra step to think, okay, I'll help the student to be successful by providing partial information, which gradually can be removed until the student can work independently.
I love that you said that, Evelyn, because it's so true. Not every child in that classroom is going to be good at art in the same way, or, sports in the same way. The same goes with learning of language. And yet, and this is not a measure of someone's intelligence. This is a measure of what speed level someone needs to go at. And one other piece is, structurally, there's a problem in that what I'm seeing is that children at younger and younger grade levels and ages are expected to do more. So kindergarten is now covering what was taught once in first grade and what was taught in second grade and first grade. So the expectation is getting younger and younger to do more advanced things, and not enough time is being given for what you said, the repetition, which can cause a huge problem too. We're seeing that, and parents, don't get caught up in this idea that your child is somehow so smart if they can do third grade work in the first grade as some victory, because they may not be getting foundationally what they need. A push for a slower, more systematic, repetitious instruction with a lot more nice time for recess and relaxation. It's not the goal to get it in early. The goal is to get it in properly, right, Evelyn?
Absolutely.
It's there, and I think parents get caught up in this way too much, and then you end up with children who are down the, in these other grades, and they just don't have the foundation. So, well, Evelyn, I want to thank you so much. I hope that the listener can see some of the dilemmas, some of the struggles, step back and ask, where are you in this? And please know you can send us any questions just go to info at transforming.education, education spelled out, and we'll be happy to answer any questions you have. So in closing, I want to thank our listeners for being a part of this important webinar series. Please send this free webinar link to your family members, your friends, your educational community members, and co-workers. It's a free service that we're providing, and the more people who know the truth about the necessary keys to unlocking education, the better for all of us. Help us get the word out, and take care, and be sure and send us any questions you have. So once again, thank you all for being with us. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.